Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry and today we'll be doing a board game comparison. I'll be comparing two board games that are very similar in the case of these two games. I'm going to be comparing Runebound 2nd Edition to Runebound 3rd Edition. And Runebound 2nd Edition, for those who don't know, is not in print any longer. I was able to get a really good used copy for a really great price. And I've been playing Runebound 3rd Edition for a few years now and highly enjoy it. And one of the debates going on around board gaming circles is which of these two is better. And quite often, people like one or the other to the exclusion of the other, right? It's very rare that people like both of these games. So I'm going to be opening up these boxes, showing you the components, going through different gameplay mechanisms, and making the comparisons and the contrasts, how these games are similar, how these games are different. And then I'm going to get to my final thoughts where I will give some strong opinions as to what I prefer from one game versus the other, and finally culminate with my decision as to which of these two is better, Runebound 2nd Edition or Runebound 3rd Edition. Let's get straight to it. So the first thing we're going to compare is actually the components of the game. We have Runebound 2nd Edition on this side, and then we have 3rd Edition on this side. And one thing to bear in mind, especially when you're talking about component quality, is the fact that these games are pretty much exactly 10 years apart. Runebound came out, 2nd Edition came out in 2005, and 3rd Edition was a 2015 release. So obviously in 10 years, and particularly those 10 years within the lifespan or the history of the industry, the component quality improved by leaps and bounds, right? So do take it with a grain of salt as I compare things. Obviously, the artwork, at least in my opinion, I like it better. It jumps at you. It's more bright and vibrant on the newer edition here, as opposed to the old edition, the 2nd edition. I did buy this brand new, and I've taken very good care of it. This is in pretty decent condition for being a game that I bought used, but again, it's an older game, so that in itself, time and inertia do their thing. So let's just unopen these and compare the insides. So first of all, we've got the rule books, and I must say that I prefer the 3rd edition because first of all, it comes with two rule books, including a rules reference for the more thorough things, and I feel like it breaks it down a little bit better, and so on and so forth. The 2nd edition rulebook has longer uninterrupted blocks of text, which may or may not work for some people. It has some artwork, but not as much diagrams as the 3rd edition's rulebook does. So there is that. So I do have some and again, the rules reference is a very helpful, handy thing to have in addition to the regular rulebook. I do have some expansions that the person who sold it to me threw in for the entire game, which again was a steal. And now we're going to compare the boards. So here is the board for 2nd edition. And the board for 2nd edition has a lot of space reserved for the cards. So the different cards in the game, the different places where you'll buy cards, different stacks of cards available, and so on and so forth. The incomplete challenges that players will deal with. And here is the 3rd edition. So first of all, again, we have more vibrant color schemes here. We also have more board space reserved and designated for actual gameplay. The mountains look a little bit more realistic, as do the forests, and so on and so forth. And very little of the board is reserved for additional stuff, right? We just have these tracks on the outer edges and a little bit of references here. You don't actually place the shopping item cards on this board. You just place them alongside of the board, and here it indicates which corresponding town it belongs to. But, so yeah, again, obviously, the color is brighter here, but this is a fine board too. I like it as well. It's just clearly smaller. The hexagons are a little bit smaller in order to, I guess, proportionally display the lands of Terranov. So that's pretty much it. Okay, there is that. So the board for Runebound 3rd edition, again, is a little bit better. Then let's compare the inserts. I like the insert of the modern one better, but let's also compare the terrain dice, the travel dice. So this game features an amazing gameplay mechanism or gameplay feature, which is the use of these terrain dice in order to move through the lands of Terranov. Now, the original game, first of all, the dice are way more plain looking, and you rely on symbols and the interpretation of these symbols to know if you're dealing with rivers or forests or mountains or plains, as opposed to here where you kind of have the image of the different fields that actually correspond with how it looks like on the actual board. So from that perspective, from an aesthetic perspective, it is better. The older game had more terrain types. I believe there's only about 5 terrain types in the new edition. The 3rd edition, the 2nd edition, I think has 7 terrain types. So there is that to factor in. Then we have the cards. We have lots of cards in both of these games. So here we have the different adventure cards that are designated by different adventure types, right? You have combat, you have exploration adventures, and you have social adventures or encounters. And here in this game, you have a little bit of those as well. But the way they designate, actually, these are not. These are the shopping items, I believe, allies and items that you can have. Which, mind you, in 3rd edition, we have these smaller cards for skills and for the assets or items that players acquire at the shop. So there is that. I think in that regard, this is more practical, takes up less space. But again, the way Runebound 2nd edition accommodated for that is by actually creating the spaces on the board for those items that you purchase. So let us see here. Well, there's that. And then we have all these different types of cards. I was mentioning that you have the 3 different types of encounters in 3rd edition. And in 2nd edition, basically, instead of having the encounters separated by decks, they're all within the same decks. You just have decks that vary in difficulty. So you have your green adventures, which are your easier adventures. Then you have your yellow adventures, which are like intermediate. You have your blue, which are harder. And then finally you have your red adventures, which are the hardest. And basically you have that choice as an adventurer, as a hero, to choose whether or not you want to pursue a more challenging adventure. And obviously, a more challenging adventure, I'm sure, comes with a much more bountiful reward, but that's something to factor in as you make your decision. Also here, I think we have the different characters that a player can control, I believe. These are the different characters. Yes, this looks like it. Right? Even though the back here has that. I think there's 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 characters that you could choose from. As opposed to the 3rd edition has much less characters to choose from, especially from the base game. I think there's only 6 characters in the base game to choose from. And their cards are oversized as such, as opposed to the smaller cards, standard size cards, from 2nd edition, right? Okay, so there is that. And then you have the miniatures, which are the bread and butter of this type of game. And definitely 3rd edition has more detailed miniatures. Ignore the poor paint job. This was my first and only attempt at painting miniatures. I did this myself. But the 3rd edition miniatures are definitely much more polished and more detailed than the 2nd edition miniatures, right? So there is that. And then finally, we have the plethora of tokens for both games. Both games come with a ton of tokens. And the aesthetic in the third edition tokens, in my opinion, is better than that of the second edition. So I must say that as far as components are concerned, not to anyone's surprise, including my own, second edition definitely wins out over third edition definitely wins out over second edition. So that's how I feel about components. Let's see what we have to say about the actual gameplay itself. All right, so now we're going to discuss some of the differences as far as actual gameplay is concerned. And the first thing to note is the difference in the board, the size of the board and the dimensions of the board. Besides the fact that the hexagonal spaces in Runebound 3rd edition, here on the right side, are larger than the hexagonal spaces on Runebound 2nd edition, but that's merely an aesthetic. But the dimensions are different. From east to west, Runebound 2nd edition covers 13 spaces and then 14 spaces from north to south. Runebound 3rd edition, however, goes 16 by 14. So that's 13 by 14 versus 16 by 14. So there is a lot more space to cover in Runebound 3rd edition. On top of all of that, there are actually more cities in Runebound 2nd edition than there are in Runebound 3rd edition. There are 4 cities in Runebound 3rd edition. We have Forge, Tamalier, Dawnsmore, and Riverwatch. In Runebound 2nd edition, we have those same 4 cities, but we have an additional 4 with Frostgate, Greyhaven, Nerrickall, and down here we have Vinalvale. And of course, the aforementioned cities are also here too. So again, you have less territory to cover here and more cities. So it's actually easier for an adventurer or for a hero to get from city to city in Runebound 2nd edition as opposed to Runebound 3rd edition. Now, we'll actually talk about the turn sequence. So now we're going to talk about the difference in turn sequence. So the difference in turn sequence, as far as the player's actions are concerned, is that Runebound 2nd edition is a phase-based turn where players will go through 5 different phases of their turn and resolve their actions accordingly. Runebound 3rd edition is an action-based turn where players have a number of actions they could take, in this case 3, and they have a pool of actions to choose from. And each of those actions is worth either 1 action or 2 actions, and players budget their turn accordingly. So in Runebound 2nd edition, you go through the 5 different phases. The first phase is the refresh phase, where you will activate or rotate any cards that had previously been activated and therefore were not available to you. You turn them back to indicate, or refresh them to indicate that they are available for you on that turn. You also move on to the second phase, which is the movement phase, where you roll a certain amount of dice. Based on the terrains that you roll on those dice, you can move throughout the map, traverse the different terrains, and make it to wherever you're trying to make it to. Then afterward, if you finished in a adventure spot, which are designated with these symbols here, these color-coded symbols for different types of adventures, if you end your turn on those spots, you move on to phase 3, which is the adventure phase, where you will flip over the card and carry out said adventure. Finally, if you ended your turn in a city, you will move on to a shopping or a market action, or the market phase, where you can buy cards that are available to you in the different cities, in the corresponding city. These could be artifacts, they could be weapons, they can be allies. You can purchase these different items or these different cards if you have the money to afford them. And finally, you move to an experience phase of your turn, where you'll be using experience tokens that you gain throughout the game in order to cash in for upgraded stats to your player character. Now in Runebound 3rd edition, again, you have 3 actions and you have a pool of actions you can take. You can choose to move, so movement is not automatic on a player's turn in Runebound 2nd and 3rd edition. Also, because you can repeat these actions, you could actually choose to move twice in one turn. So you could choose to cover lots of terrain by making both of 2 out of your 3 actions, or even all 3 of them, movement actions. Also, if you want to adventure, that costs a lot. That action costs 2 actions. 2 out of your 3 actions will go towards adventuring if you are in, again, one of these spots with these colored symbols on them. In this case, we have the green, the purple, and the red. So there's that. You can also choose to rest in Runebound 3rd edition. It's a little bit easier to heal. If you're in a city, or if you're in one of the special spaces, the shrine, the stronghold, and the castle, if you're in one of those spaces, you can heal fully. If you're in a specific terrain, then you have to roll dice, and according to what you roll, you can heal a certain amount. So there's that. You can also choose to shop. Shopping is an action that you could choose to take if you end your turn in a city. And you'll always have a bunch of cards available to you to choose from for the shopping. You could also choose to train, and training is a way of acquiring skill cards in your hand. And those skill cards are not necessarily cards that you take for granted. They're not necessarily cards that you have at your disposal, but they are cards that eventually you can earn for your character to upgrade him or her. And for the most part, I believe those are the different actions you can take as far as Runebound 3rd edition is concerned. So now that we've talked about the board, we've talked about turn sequence, now let's talk about and break down some of these actual actions that we'll be doing through the game. Let's talk about movement, because movement is key in both of these games. You have lots of land to cover. You'll be trying to get to specific places depending on your objectives. In both games, both games come with a set of 5 different dice. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the Runebound 3rd edition dice are a little bit more colorful. But from a practical perspective, what is the difference? One of the major differences is that the Runebound 2nd edition dice feature 7 different terrain types. Here, Runebound 3rd edition has streamlined it a bit, and we only have 5 different terrain types. First of all, roads represent a individual terrain type in Runebound 2nd edition. Runebound 3rd edition includes roads as well. However, they are not their own terrain type as far as the dice are concerned. You can actually move through the roads just like you would as treating it as a wild, basically. So to enter into a road, you must have the corresponding feature, but once you're on a road, you can continue traveling along the road with any terrain type. So if I have mountains and forests, but I want to take advantage of this road, I could turn in those mountain and forest dice. Even though these terrain types are all plains, I could use them to follow the yellow brick road to where I'm trying to get to. So that's the first thing. Another very important difference is that in Runebound 2nd edition, unless otherwise specified, you're always going to roll these 5 dice for movement. So that's going to be the default amount of dice you roll. However, in Runebound 3rd edition, you're going to roll dice according to the speed of your character. Speed is a new stat as far as Runebound 3rd edition is concerned. And most heroes or most characters' speed stat ranges between 3 to 4. So for the most part, you're going to be rolling 3 or sometimes maybe 4 dice in the game to move your hero. But in Runebound 3rd edition, you do have some skills and some items that you could acquire throughout the course of the game that will increase your speed and therefore give you more dice to roll. I guess another important feature is that one of the 6 sides of the die in Runebound is a wild, which you can use for any terrain feature. There is not necessarily a wild, so to speak, in Runebound 2nd edition dice. And I think one of the reasons for that is to make up for the fact that, again, players will be rolling less dice for the most part, and they're also covering more terrain. So to make up for those challenges, Runebound 3rd edition gives you one entire side of the dice that is wild, and it also gives you the ability to choose multiple movement actions with your turn. So let's just talk about the content that the game comes with. So first of all, Runebound 2nd Edition comes with up to 12 different heroes that players can choose from. So you've got the Battle Mage Jayas, hope I'm saying that correctly. You got Varicus the Dead. You have Red Scorpion. You have Mordrog. You have Bogran the Shadow. You have Spirit Speaker Mach. You have Sir Valadir. You have Mad Karthos. You have One Fist. You have Rune Wish Astara. You got Silhouette. You got Ronan of the Wild. So those are 12 playable characters. The base game of Runebound 3rd Edition only comes with 6 different playable characters. We've got Corbin the Dwarf here. You've got Laurel of Bloodwood. You have Lord Hawthorne. You have Master Thorn. You have Lysa. And you have, again, Elder Mach, who was also in 2nd Edition. So you have twice as many playable characters straight off the bat from the base game in Runebound 2nd Edition as opposed to only 6 in Runebound 3rd Edition. However, one very important thing is Runebound 2nd Edition really only has one quest. You're basically playing the same quest every time you play, with some variation, and again, factoring in the different characters you play. Runebound 3rd Edition comes with 2 playable quests. First of all, we have the quest that involves High Lord Margath as the final ultimate boss, and we have the quest with Vorakesh, the Necromancer, as the final boss of the game. So you have these 2 altering objectives or quests as far as Runebound 3rd Edition is concerned. So again, you have a little bit more variety as far as the quest is concerned. Here you have a little bit more variety as far as the playable characters are concerned. As far as the system goes, Runebound 3rd Edition, for the most part, is in print, so there is a huge advantage on that. But it does not have too many expansions. It has one kind of big expansion called Unbreakable Bonds, and basically 4 small expansions, 2 that add 2 more heroes to the game, along with some other shop items and skill cards that players can acquire, and another 2 small expansions that add 2 more masterminds and 2 more quests with the corresponding challenge cards and also storyline cards to add some flavor to their game. So there is a little bit of content out there for Runebound 3rd Edition, and for the most part, it's easier to get than Runebound 2nd Edition. However, Runebound 2nd Edition has tons and tons of expansions out there, and right now it is out of print. It's never going to get reprinted, and you can get them on the secondhand market on BoardGameGeek.com, and most of these expansions are being sold for a pretty penny. Remember, I was able to get Runebound 2nd Edition for a really good price, so there is always hope that the expansions you might get lucky and catch an expansion at a decent price in the future. We'll see. So there is that. So again, from a content perspective, Runebound 3rd Edition, straight off the bat, I think Runebound 2nd Edition comes with a little bit more content because of the different characters, the 12 different characters. But Runebound 3rd Edition does have those 2 quests and the fact that they have lots of content currently available. So let's make some comparisons between the heroes here. So first of all, in Runebound 2nd Edition, heroes will always start in Tamalier, right? You have no choice. In Runebound 3rd Edition, each character has a different symbol. You have these special locations, these 3 different types of special locations that are scattered throughout the board. And each hero has one of those 3 designated for him or her. And the player gets to choose where on the board they start their character as long as it's on one of those special locations. So it gives the players an additional layer of choice to start the game as to where they want to be based on whatever objectives they want to accomplish or whatever shopping items perhaps they might see that are already available on the board. Also, as I mentioned earlier, I indicated earlier, the hero characters now have an additional stat, which is their speed, which determines how much dice they roll. Also, if you notice here, they don't have a fatigue stat as far as that is concerned. There is no statistic here for fatigue, but there is a statistic for fatigue as far as second edition is concerned, and their health is incredibly higher. They have 9 health, for example, this character here, Lysa here, also has 9 health, so they range from, I guess, 7 to 9, and the characters here range from 4 to 6, and only one character that I could see even has 6. Most of the characters here have either 4 or 5 health. So that part is also interesting. Also, an additional stat that players have is they have a skill hand limit, right? Because you're going to be acquiring these different skill cards, which, as I said, as the game progresses, you might actually add these skills to your repertoire. You don't necessarily have them in your repertoire just because you have them in your hand. So this is how much skill cards each player can have at capacity. Each hero also has a few special abilities, and then they have their different stats for might, for mind, and for spirit, which basically corresponds with these here. However, these have no relevance to actual attacking as opposed to Runebound 2nd Edition. These stats will help you with your attack. These stats are only helpful for different skill-based tests that you'll be taking throughout the game. Now, besides the 3 major categories of mind, body, and spirit in Runebound 2nd Edition, you also have additional skills, further breaking down with underneath the umbrella of mind, body, and spirit. And as you draw different adventure cards with different types of encounters and events even, you're going to have these skill tests that will be based on characters' specific skills, right? Subsets, again, of these 3 major skill sets, mind, body, and spirit. And again, you'll have a number here. So for example, Ronan the Wild has a skill of climb +2. So you modify any climb skill test he might take. High +2 and swim +2. And that's it. And that's pretty much it as far as the differences of the heroes are concerned. Another important thing I should mention as far as heroes are concerned, I mentioned that they have no fatigue stat as opposed to the heroes in Runebound 2nd Edition. But what they do is, instead of fatigue, which sometimes is used as in Runebound 2nd Edition as a voluntary sacrifice in order to be able to do something else. So for example, Ronan could take 1 fatigue in order to re-roll 1 of his movement dice. In Runebound 3rd Edition, instead of having fatigue, what they have is the exhaust ability. And you can exhaust, which means discard 1 of the skill cards in your hand of skill cards to re-roll 1 of those dice, right? And also, exhaust is something you could use whenever resolving a skill test. If after drawing the allocated amount of cards on a specific skill test, because that's how skills are resolved here, you could always choose to exhaust cards from your hand in order to get more opportunities for those particular skill tests. Now let's talk about a very important feature or mechanism in this game, which is the combat or the conflict. Even though Runebound is not necessarily all about combat, combat is a very important factor in both 2nd and 3rd edition. I will say it's even more important in 2nd edition than it is in 3rd. However, it's very important in both of these games. Now, let's talk about combat first in Runebound 2nd Edition. In Runebound 2nd Edition, you have your typical, traditional, conventional dice rolling for conflict resolution. So the game comes with these 2 10-sided dice. And the numbers range from 0 through 9. However, for whatever reason, the zeros are actually to be treated as tens. So that's actually a very important thing. I played a few games where I treated the zeros as zeros, and as you can imagine, I did not do very well. So basically, every time you have a combat, you're going to compare your hero stats to the stats of an enemy. So let me just grab an enemy here and show you what that looks like. So here we have Laurentis the Savage. And basically, each hero and each enemy has 3 different stats. Again, your mind, your body, and your spirit, which corresponds to 3 different layers or 3 different facets of the attack. You have the mind, which corresponds with your ranged attack. You have your body, which corresponds with your melee attack. And you have your spirit, which corresponds with your magic attack. And every time an attack sequence takes place, or a combat round, as they refer to it, takes place, it always goes in that same sequence, from left to right. First you have your range, then you have your melee, and then finally you have your magic. Unless you have some other card that alters that typical order, it's always going to be that way. So what's going to happen is you're going to choose one at a time whether or not you're going to defend or attack in each of those areas. And the difference between defending and attacking is when you defend, you're going to roll the dice just as if you would if you attack. However, no matter what you roll, you're not going to inflict damage on your opponent. You're simply trying to prevent the enemy from inflicting damage on you. If you want to actually strike the enemy, you have to choose to attack. So based on the comparisons of your stats and an enemy's stats, you would choose whether you're going to attack and defend, because in each combat round, which consists of the 3 different types of combat, 1 of each, you could only attack once. So only one of those 3 stats can be used to attack for each given combat round. So of course you would choose the one that you think gives you the best modifier, or the one in which your opponent, the enemy, has their weakest number that you need to resolve with. Or perhaps you'll choose it based on how much damage you inflict. Because if you see right here, you see the little backslash there. The number to the right is how much damage you would inflict. So Ronan of the Wild, for mind, has a modifier of 3. However, he only inflicts 2 damage if he actually gets a hit. And right here we see that Laurentis the Savage has 4 hearts, so that's how much damage you must dish out. Now, you would roll the 10-sided dice, let's say. Here I roll a 7. You would apply your modifier, which is 3 in this case, so that would be a total of 10. Add any other potential modifiers you might have based on experience upgrades or any different assets that you might have acquired, and then compare it to the mind total of the enemy you're fighting. In this case, a 14 would not be enough. So what happens is, even though you can only hurt the enemy in one of the 3 phases per combat round, you are susceptible or vulnerable in all 3 phases. So every time you fail to meet the number, in this case I failed to reach 14, you incur damage equal to the amount on the other side of the backslash there, which is a 2 in this case. Since I failed to meet the 14, I would take 2 damage to my character. Then you would proceed, you would roll the 2 10-sided dice once again, and proceed to the body or the melee fighting. Here I got a 9 with my modifier of 2. That would be a total of 11. And in this case, I would need a 17. This is a very powerful character, by the way, so that's why I'm failing to hit them. But it's just to explain the way it goes. And then finally, you would go and you would do the magic attack. Add the modifiers. So I rolled a 14 plus a 2 is 16. Compare it to the 13. But in this case, I already chose, let's say I chose my attack. I'm only defending. But that is high enough to cover the 13 and not take the 2-pointer. So in order to dish out damage, you need to roll a number plus your modifier equal to or higher than their stat here. However, in order for them to deal damage, whatever you roll needs to be lower than their number here. So that's basically it. You're rolling these dice, you're adding any modifiers, you're comparing them, your stats to the stat of your enemy. Based on your stats, you dish out a certain amount of damage, and so on and so forth. Now, the only way that you can attack, and you keep on repeating this, you could have multiple combat rounds until either you or the enemy is defeated, or until you choose to flee. Fleeing is always an option. But the only way you can attack in all three phases of the combat round is by having allies. Allies are a powerful card that you acquire throughout the game. They are, human or characters of different races that have their own stats. They have their own life, their own combat stats, and some special abilities that help you with the combat. By the way, there are no allies in Runebound 3rd Edition. You're completely on your own in that regard. But what happens with allies is you can use your allies for the different combat phases. So in this Runebound 2nd Edition, you could have up to 2 allies in your possession at a time. So if you have those 2 allies, you can choose one of each of those allies for each of the other 2 combat phases that you cannot actively attack in. So by you choosing an ally for each of the other 2, plus one of them for your main hero, you'll be able to attack in all 3 of the spheres of combat. However, all the casualties would be taken by the corresponding characters that engaged in that particular fight. So your allies would take any damage that would befall them based on failing these attack attempts. So that's basically the way that attack works in Runebound 2nd Edition. Now, Runebound 3rd Edition, this is probably the greatest weakness of Runebound 3rd Edition, and it's that the attacking or the combat is determined by these tokens here that players are casting, seeing where they land. So you got a 50-50 chance, you know what each of the different sides has, and then based on that, determining what they do. So the enemies have their own special tokens that you cast, and some of these symbols are colored gold, right? They have gold coloring as opposed to white coloring. And the first thing you would do after players cast their tokens is they compare how many gold was rolled by the hero versus the enemy, and whoever rolled the most gold will have initiative, which means they attack first. In Runebound 2nd Edition, theoretically, unless some card indicates otherwise, the hero always has initiative. In Runebound 3rd Edition, initiative is determined by the casting of the tokens and seeing who has the most gold tokens. After that's all done, players are going to take turns, combat by combat phase, but it's a little bit more fluid in Runebound 3rd Edition. You don't go from range to melee to magic. You can choose. You do have 3 different types of attacks. You have your physical attack designated by these axe symbols right here. You have your magic attack designated by this little symbol right here. And finally, you have these surges, which usually correspond with some sort of special ability that a character gives you, or that your skills or items or weapons give you. And usually it involves some type of damage being dealt. Now, when a player makes a choice to attack, they choose all of their tokens that match that symbol. So for example, if I roll 2 axes and I'm going to choose to attack with physical attack first, I would have to use both of these at once and use all of them at the same time, and then deal that much damage to your opponent. Then your opponents would choose, if they had casted any shields, they can choose to use their shields to block off some of that damage, right? And then the enemy would choose, and they only have one type of attack basically, which is these skull symbols right here. And they also have their own surges, which usually give them special abilities that are related to either attacking or perhaps even healing themselves. And this way, combat would continue until each player or the hero and the enemy have all used all of their tokens. And then that would signal the end of the combat phase. And then the hero would have the choice to either flee, back out of the fight, or continue and enter into an additional combat phase until the enemy is defeated or until the hero is knocked out. So that's basically the way that combat works. So again, you have the two-sided dice. It's a little bit more predictable, tactically speaking, maybe a little bit less satisfying. But as the game goes on and you're acquiring different items and equipment and weapons at the shop, those items, weapons, and equipment not only have a card that specifies special abilities, but more often than not, they come with additional tokens that you will be casting. So the game starts, each hero has 3 tokens that they're casting, and as the game progresses, they're going to have 4, 5, maybe even up to 6 tokens that they'll be able to cast in combat rounds. And that's pretty much it as far as combat is concerned. And now let's talk about the true heart of the game, which is the adventuring. And in both games, you're going to go on what the games call adventures. And they're based on these pre-populated spaces on the board that have tokens corresponding with different colors. In Runebound 2nd Edition, you have green, yellow, blue, and red. And in Runebound 3rd Edition, you have green, purple, and red. The difference in these games, besides the fact that Runebound 2nd Edition has 4 different colors, is what the colors designate. In Runebound 2nd Edition, the colors don't designate necessarily the type of adventure you'll be going on, but instead the difficulty. So for example, the green adventures, which are the majority, are the easiest adventures. Then you have your next level, which is your yellow adventures. Then you have your blue adventures. And finally, you have your hardest adventures, which are your red adventures. And all of these decks consist mostly of combat challenges, characters and enemies that you will be engaging in conflict with. That is the majority of these cards, regardless of the color or the difficulty of the deck. Now, there are some additional cards here that are not combat. For example, you have these event cards, which basically add some storyline to the game and change the rules of the game up a little bit as long as they are active, and they will be continuing to cycle and get replaced. You also have these encounters, which you will read and see. Basically, they have perhaps some type of skill quest, skill test, or some quest of some type that you might have to fulfill in order to get a benefit. You might have to go to a specific location, accomplish a specific thing, turn in something specifically in order to reap whatever its benefit is. So you have these encounter cards and these events, but again, for the most part, you have enemies that you're combating, which is why I say that in Runebound 2nd Edition, there's definitely more fighting going on than in Runebound 3rd Edition. So that's something to factor in when you're determining which of the two you would prefer for yourself. Runebound 2nd Edition is definitely more confrontational and conflict heavy. Now, Runebound 3rd Edition only has these 3 different colors, the orange, the green, and the purple. And basically, these do not designate difficulty. What they designate is different types of adventures. So for example, your orange here with the sword symbol, these are your combat adventures. And your green here with the torch, these are your questing adventures. And then finally here, the purple one with the envelope here, these are your social adventures. So basically your combat adventures, as the name would indicate, means you're fighting different baddies, comparing your stats to their stats, rolling, or in this case, casting your tokens, and resolving the conflict. The questing cards involve different choices. Well, actually, no, not choices. They involve, that's what the questing cards look like. They involve different parts of the actual map, different regions and areas and towns that you'll be going to try to fulfill specific needs. Usually these are dice-based. You'll be rolling the movement dice to accomplish them in order to accomplish different levels of bonuses. So depending on what you're willing to settle for, you can keep on trying and trying and trying until you accomplish a certain bonus or unlock a certain bonus and get whatever benefit is there. So these are really cool, these questing adventures. And then finally, your social ones involve these choices. You meet some character, some personality along the way, and they give you a choice. And basically, you look at the two choices and decide which one best fits your needs, which one best fits your ultimate goals and your reality, right? And you make your decision accordingly. So that's how it works. Now, however, every deck has all three of these types of adventures. You have your combat, your quests, and your social encounters. But the color determines what the majority of the deck has. So orange, the orange deck has mostly combat encounters. The green deck has mostly quest adventures. And the purple deck has mostly social encounters. So this gives the player an element of choice. In Runebound's second edition, you're making your choice based on how strong you feel. Do you feel strong enough to go for that yellow card? Or should you stick to the green card in the meantime as you work to building that strength? So those are basically the options that are running through your mind. In Runebound third edition, you're making a decision, do I even want to combat at all? What type of game do I want to have? And while it's very helpful to compete in all these different types of encounters, it's not necessarily mandatory. And you probably can't get away without having any combat. First of all, the luck of the draw, again, there's combat in each of the three decks. But also just, you might want to get some of the benefits. The combats usually provide a little bit more gold than some of the other types of encounters you have. But the point is, you can make the decision conscientiously at the beginning of the game to say, you know what, I'm not going to be very combat heavy. I'm going to try to avoid combat as much as possible and try to accomplish my means, acquire gold and upgrades in different ways that don't require combat. You do have that option. And then you always have that, oh, I ran into an enemy. I didn't even mean to, but, they were there in my path, and it gives this spontaneous feel to the game. As opposed to Runebound 2nd Edition, which, by the way, I didn't mention, in Runebound 2nd Edition, even when you draw an event or a encounter card as opposed to an enemy challenge, that does not end your adventuring phase. If you draw one of those two cards, an encounter or an event, you resolve it accordingly, set it aside, and then you draw another card from that adventure color until you finally have a combat. So you are guaranteed to have a fight in Runebound 2nd Edition, as opposed to Runebound 3rd Edition, where if you go to certain other colors, there's a good chance you won't be fighting. So again, there is that element of feeling in control and also choosing a slightly different path to accomplishing your objective in Runebound 3rd Edition by maybe perhaps choosing to not go with the combat approach of the game. Now we're going to see how skill tests are resolved in the different games. So first of all, Runebound, all the skill tests, just like the combats, revolve around these two 10-sided dice. So you will encounter different skill tests mostly through the encounter cards, but occasionally even on a combat challenge, right? You'll have something like a before combat feature on an enemy, and quite often there'll be a test. And every time you see a test, you'll see the word test, you'll see the symbol indicating which of the three main attributes you'll be testing. But on top of that, you'll see, in many cases at least, a word after it like climb, which refers to a subset within that. So you have the hand here, which is the body attribute, and then you have climb, which is a subset of that attribute. So this is a climbing test. So whenever you roll the dice, so here I'll roll, I have a 5 and an 8, that's a 13. You'll add your modifier for the specific attribute, In this case, my body modifier is 2. So 13 plus 2 is 15. And then if there is a subset of that attribute, in this case, climb, you will look and see if your hero has a stat for that subset. And in the case of Running the Wild, I do, climb plus 2. So I'll add an additional modifier to that skill test. And if after all modifiers are applied, you have a number equal to or higher than the number requested by the skill test, then you successfully pass that skill test and get whatever benefit or prevent whatever casualty you would incur. Now, in Runebound 3rd edition, these skill tests are also attribute based. So basically here, you would look here and it has test and it has the eye symbol there, which refers to the mind. And you would look at a character's mind attributes. So for example, in the case of the red scorpion here, her mind attribute in yellow is a 2. And based on her attribute, you would add any modifiers, because again, you might acquire equipment or skills throughout the game that add or modify these 3 different attributes of might, mind, and spirit. You would add any modifiers, and then you would test in that attribute. And the way you test is you draw cards from the skill deck. So these skill deck cards actually serve multiple purposes. Not only are they your cards that you acquire in your hand of skill cards in order to eventually hopefully turn them in and add them to your repertoire, but they also serve as the skill test. So you would draw cards from the skill deck equal to the number of your attribute after any modifiers have been applied. So in the case of Red Scorpion, with a 2, let's say she had an item or an artifact that added 1 to her mind, I would draw 3, let's say. You would draw 3 cards, and one by one, you're looking to see for this little symbol right there. It's like a little star right here under this little label here. You have a star in the upper right here. Not all cards have that. As a matter of fact, the majority of cards do not. So usually when you're testing for a success, you're just waiting to draw that first star. Once you've drawn that first star, you have succeeded. Unless, of course, you're dealing with a specific skill test that demands more than one success. But those are occasional at best. So that's how you succeed. You draw cards equal to your attribute stat. And once you've drawn one card that has that star symbol on the upper right, you have succeeded. The best part about testing, which I do like this system of skill tests, it's luck-based, but it's not rolling the dice. It's more of a probability thing. So you feel a little bit more in control in that sense. You know your odds, so to speak. But also, let's say you fail in a skill test. Once you've drawn cards equal to the amount of your attribute stat, plus any other modifiers, you're not done. If you have any cards in your personal hand of skill cards, you can discard one, or as the game refers to it, exhaust, in order to add an additional opportunity to test for that skill. So it lets you draw another card. So again, if you feel like you have a good chance, it's a little bit of a push your luck in that sense, but perhaps you might have a skill in your hand that you either know you're never going to be able to accomplish because its requirements are too high, or you know that you're not interested in it, it's trashy to you, it's garbage. It doesn't hurt to use that to exhaust. So these skill cards in your hand actually serve multiple purposes in that sense. So that's the way skills are resolved. And again, once you've drawn one of those star symbols, or in a case of specific skill test, maybe even more than one. Once you've drawn that, you have succeeded in your skill tests. So now we're going to talk about the story feel of the 2 different games. So basically, both games are very story driven. They both take place in the same universe, the Terranoff universe. There's lots of overlapping characters even in both games. Now, what adds to the storyline feel of each of the respective games are some of the cards. So in Runebound 2nd edition, as you go on these different adventures, aside from the challenges, which are most of the cards, you also have these encounters, which, as I mentioned, add a little bit of storyline feel. There's lots of flavor text and some interesting decisions that need to be made. But you also have these event cards, and there's a few of these event cards in each of the decks. And the event cards not only indicate something that's transpired in the overall narrative of what's going on in this game, but they also make some changes to the actual gameplay. Some things are different. So for example, here we have like animals before a storm, and we have a little bit of text here. A long shadow stretches across the land, chilling all those it touches. In response to the time of unrest, the towns are being more stringent on who they allow inside their walls. And it says when your hero enters a town space, you need to test your spirit, in particular diplomacy, to a total of 12. Your total experience points values from both adventure counters and experience counters is added as a bonus to this roll. If you fail, you may not enter the town space. So this event, for example, makes entering town spaces in future turns not an automatic thing. It sounds very reasonable. 12 as your modifier, plus the 12 as the number you're trying to reach, plus you have your experience counters and your adventure counters, which have numbers on them, and you can add those totals to your modifiers. So it sounds reasonable, but the point is it's not a given from that point to be able to enter the towns. So that is how Runebound 2nd edition contributes to the storyline or narrative feel of the game. Runebound 2nd edition. Runebound 3rd edition has these story cards, and you're always going to have 10 of these cards set apart depending on what quest and what mastermind you're dealing with. And basically, these cards, you're only going to draw 8 of them throughout the game, so not all 10 will be drawn. These cards indicate either one-time occurrences or special plot twists in the narrative that basically correspond with the map. So usually they'll have some area in the map that's set apart and designated. You'll place a token there, and you'll place the story card on the corresponding number that matches that token, so you'll know what story plot card corresponds with a particular location. And basically, it'll have something that you could go there to do, to accomplish, that will help you with the overall objective of the game, which is defeating the mastermind or the baddie at the end of the game. So that's how it is. You read some of the text, you read where on the map of Terranov this story interacts with, see what's its condition, what you're trying to accomplish, set it aside, and going forward, the players have that in their back of their mind. They always have it to reference up here if they ever are nearby a specific location and say, hey, what the heck, I'm close. Maybe I want to remember what's going on over here. They could read their story card over there and be refreshed and reminded as to what this location is all about. So those are the 2 different ways that these games impact or add to the story-driven feel of the gameplay. So now let's talk about some of the unique features of each of these games. So first of all, what's particularly unique about Runebound 2nd edition, which I appreciate, is the use of these ally cards. These ally cards are really, really cool. First of all, they add to the feeling of the game, the lore of the game, the different characters. There's so many different personalities that you deal with in this game, because not only do you have 12 different heroes you can interact with, but you have all these different allies that you can potentially, hopefully, gain their aid or gain their services. So I feel like the ally cards are a neat way of interacting with the combat and different aspects of the gameplay. Now, as far as Runebound 3rd edition is concerned, they don't have allies, but what Runebound 3rd edition does have is, as I mentioned earlier, these hand of skill cards. And these skill cards serve lots of purposes. As I mentioned, you can exhaust them in order to re-roll a movement die. You can exhaust them in order to add additional opportunities to your skill test but also you can just outright buy them in order to add them to your hero's repertoire and gain whatever benefit. So on the upper left-hand corner of these cards, you'll see these little circles. And a clear circle here means that you can turn in the designated amount of cards, or trophies as they refer to it, which are all based on your successfully accomplished adventures right here. You can turn those in order to buy the card. So, for example, these 3 cards, each here, respectively cost any one trophy card. However, sometimes you'll see a color shaded in, for example, purple, orange, green, and that means that for those, you'll specifically need a trophy or an adventure card that matches that color. So sometimes you'll be going on very particular quests in order to gain those colored cards. And whenever you turn in the corresponding amount of cards or trophies, you have successfully added that skill to your repertoire. So for example, here you have the battle sorcery skill, which says once per round as a combat action, you may exert, which again refers to the discarding of the cards. I've been calling it exhaust all this time. It's exert. You can exert and test your spirit to deal 2 magic damage that cannot be blocked. So in other words, they cannot use their shields for that. So that's an additional ability, a way of leveling up your character. So in 2nd edition, you have other ways of leveling up your character, which is very important. So in 3rd edition, you level up your character through the use of the acquisition of items and weapons, which you're also doing in Runebound 2nd edition. But again, you have these skills that you'll be hopefully accomplishing and adding to your repertoire as the game progresses. Now, in Runebound 3rd edition, the way you level up your character is through the successful combat or completion of these different adventures. And every time you successfully accomplish an adventure, you're going to get its corresponding token that's on the board. Again, these pre-populated tokens. And on the opposite side of these tokens, you'll see a number. So for example, the green adventures will give you a 1. The yellow adventures will give you a 2. The blue adventures will give you a 3. And the red adventures will give you a 4. And those are basically your experience points, because the last phase in a turn order in Runebound 2nd edition is your experience phase, where you can optionally turn in experience points depending on the player count. So the higher the player count, the less amount of experience points you have to turn in. You turn in a certain amount of experience points to add an experience counter to your hero. And basically, the experience counters correspond with the different stats. So you can add yourself a mind experience counter, which will give you an additional modifier of +2. You can add a body experience counter, which will give you an additional modifier of +2 for body, or an additional spirit modifier of +2. Also, you can turn in a experience points to add heart or life to your heroes. That way, or even exhaust to your hero to add their stats for that, so that they could incur more damage before being knocked out. And all of these different level ups you can do multiple times. So you can level up your character to your liking. You could focus on building up their mind as much as possible, to the detriment of perhaps some of their other attributes. So that is a really, really cool way of leveling up. It feels a little bit more, I guess, RPG-like in Runebound 2nd edition because of these tokens that are basically modifiers, as opposed to Runebound 3rd edition, which is just the additional acquisition of some skills that in some cases are very, very powerful and very helpful. So those are the 2 different ways that the games handle leveling up, character progression, so to speak. And I think they both do it very effectively, but absolutely in very different ways. Now we're going to talk about the Endgame trigger. So Runebound 3rd edition is much more rote, much more fixed in its endgame condition. You have this track here, which you will go through twice, each representing a different act. The game is divided into 2 acts. And the track consists of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 spaces. So basically you are going to go through this track 12 times, twice a piece, 24 spaces, 24 turns, each corresponding with a turn for each player. And after those 24 turns, you pretty much have to defeat, or before those 24 turns are done, you need to defeat your mastermind for that quest. Now, for some quests, for example, Margath, you technically have a few more turns past the 24, but that's pretty much a fixed amount. Now, theoretically, if you feel strong enough, several rounds before, you could cut the game short by defeating or trying to defeat the mastermind and hopefully winning. But again, you basically have that fixed time frame of 24 turns. In Runebound second edition, the original rules did not really have a good ending. You kind of played until a player finally defeats Margath, and Margath would be found in the red deck of adventure cards. So obviously that will be later on in the game because players are not going to be that strong to beat Margath early on in the game. But it's kind of left to chance, and it's also left to the discretion of the players because the players can choose to take their time to build their characters as much as possible. So the game can drag on, which is exactly why they include the Doom Track variant, which the rulebook actually recommends, even though it doesn't mention it as the main way of playing, it recommends that you play that way. And what the Doom Track does is that it gives a certain timer to the game so that you don't feel like you have an infinite amount of time to build up your character. So what happens is every time a certain amount of encounter cards or adventure cards are done away with, either combats that you successfully accomplished or different quests or encounter cards that you've set aside because they're no longer relevant, after a certain amount are accumulated, you line them up with each of the different city spaces here. And after a certain amount have been pulled out, depending on the player count, that triggers the addition of a Doom token on one of the 8 cities of Terranoff here. So after a certain amount of questing, you're going to get a Doom token here. And what happens is, once this Doom track, or these 8 cities, each have a Doom token on it, it will trigger the end game in which players will be forced to try to fight and meet Margath for the end game condition. So basically, this gives players a time frame to work with, because with each quest, each adventure they go on, each success that they accomplish, they're actually speeding up and progressing the game. So they do not have an infinite amount of combats they can get in to try to acquire as much gold and level up their characters as much as possible. They do not have all of that time, so they have to work within that scope, make their decisions based on that. So I find that to be a neat and interesting endgame condition. I find it to make it feel more fluid than Runebound. You feel more in control. You also don't feel as bad if you have a bad turn, because you don't feel like you've necessarily wasted a certain amount of turns that are allotted to you. In Runebound 3rd edition, since you know you only have 24 turns, when you have what you deem to be an inferior or bad turn, it can be very, very frustrating. So there is an advantage to that sense, the fluidity of the game. And technically, even though the rulebook doesn't specify, you can modify the Doom Track variant to some extent by changing the amount of cards that are required to add each individual Doom Track token. And that's what I've done in order to kind of gauge for difficulty level. I've been able to come up with different ways of modifying that, and that's been very helpful. But again, I think the end game trigger here being more open-ended with players being in more control is definitely a really good feature of Runebound 2nd edition. Another thing that I didn't mention is about shopping. So each of these cards, each of these towns here are pre-populated with one card from the item deck. And every time you go to a city, you add an additional card from the item deck in order to have some choices, right? So you can go to the city, and if you don't buy anything, theoretically, more and more cards can accumulate in specific towns, but there is no guarantee that you'll have more than one card to choose from in a given town. And more often than not, you're only going to be choosing from two different item cards or different asset cards. It could be an artifact, it could be a weapon, it could be an ally. For the most part, you're going to be choosing between two cards. In Runebound 3rd edition, even though there's only 4 towns, right? Runebound 2nd edition has 8 towns as opposed to 4. Runebound 3rd edition has 4, but each of those towns has 3 visible item cards, or assets as they call them, that are visibly available to you. And every time you enter a town, you flip over a 4th card. So in Runebound 3rd edition, you're always going to have 4 cards to choose from. So again, it gives you that sense of choice. It gives you the sense of, again, they're all visibly there, so you could see 12 cards and see which ones you could afford, which ones are in your best interest. So again, you feel like you have a little bit more choice with the buying. However, I get it. Runebound 2nd edition has more towns to begin with. So theoretically, you have your choices laid out in front of you in all the different cities. However, sometimes you don't want to go to you might have a really good asset card, but it's really, really far away, and you might not want to waste the time going there. So there is that to factor in. Me in particular, again, I vary it a little bit. I modify it a little bit. And what I do is I actually start each city with 3 item cards or 3 asset cards there, which is perhaps a little bit of a cheat. But again, for me, having that, feeling of control is very important. So I do make that modification. And, that's, a player's discretion. You could choose to follow exactly as the rules say. But that's something I do. So I do feel that Runebound has that advantage as far as the choices for the shopping items. And finally, the last comparison that I'm going to make for today is the solo play in these games. I have not played Runebound with the Unbreakable Bonds expansion, which I hear adds a very functional cooperative and even solo mode to the game. But I just play solo the way it's recommended on the Board Game Geek forums, which is really simple, really. You just play the game regularly, because this game is multiplayer solitaire. You play the game regularly, but every time you encounter an enemy, instead of having one of your opponents cast the tokens and making the decisions for you, or for the enemy, you cast the tokens for your enemy as well, and you make decisions that are in the best interest of the enemy, right? So you do have to be unbiased and objective, and pretty a big person in that sense. In Runebound 2nd edition, the solo play is very much streamlined. This is even more multiplayer solitaire because combat is just resolved with the rolling of dice and the comparison of some stats on cards. There's no need to have an additional player, right? And basically the rules make very clear distinctions as to how to modify the game for a one-player game. So it tells you how to modify the Doom track based on the fact that you're playing a one-player game. It tells you how to modify the experience and the leveling up based on a one-player game. So all of these things are adjusted to fit to a T the solo player experience, which makes the Runebound solo game much more streamlined than the 3rd edition. And that's pretty much it as far as the comparisons. I'm just going to get to my final thoughts and tell you guys what I have to say. Oh man, oh man, oh man. I've been dying to make this comparison for a very long time. And I must say, it's been a fun experience comparing these two games. First of all, anybody who's been following this channel for a while knows that Runebound is in my top 50 board games of all time. If you haven't watched that video, please check it out. It makes it to lots of my individual top 10 videos quite often. So you know that I enjoy the game and I'm very fond of it. So for many years, I've been hearing about Runebound 2nd edition and how it's not just an older, antiquated edition. It's a completely different design for the most part, with different designers and slightly different mechanisms. It's not radically different, and obviously the overall idea is the same thing, but it is different enough to the point that I hear quite often that most players like one and not the other. So before moving forward with any of my final thoughts, the first thing I want to get right out in the open, just to start off with, is the fact that I am probably an exception to the rule. I like both of these games. I personally don't feel any need to get rid of one versus the other. I look at them almost as expansions of one another or even spin-offs of one another that both in their own right have a place in the gaming world, in the gaming hobby, and in particular in my board game collection. So with that being said, let's talk about some of the comparisons. So I've alluded to some of my opinions already in the comparison of the different mechanisms. So first of all, obviously components, Runebound 3rd edition, much newer game, much better components. But as far as the gameplay is concerned, I do like the fact that Runebound 3rd edition has streamlined a lot of things. I feel that movement has been streamlined in many ways through the use of the roads as just a wild terrain that you can move through, as opposed to having a separate symbol and a dice to factor in the Runebound 2nd edition. The fact that one of the sides of the die is a wild is really cool. And even the fact that the different characters have different speed stats and will roll different amount of dice, I think that adds to the asymmetry of the different characters that players will be playing with. So I will say that. Combat, I absolutely have to give it to Runebound 2nd edition. Even though it is a roll to resolve type of conflict resolution, it's still a very satisfying one, because comparing all those different stats and the different modifiers, factoring that in, the comparison between your character's stats and the enemy stats that you're fighting, and also factoring in the fact that theoretically you can only attack once, or at least your hero can only attack once, and if you add allies, you can add some attacks, and you have to defend 2 out of those 3 phases of combat. I find that to be a really neat mechanism, and factoring in, because you're not always going to do the same. Sometimes you might choose you might choose range because that's where your stat's the best and you want to increase your chances, but sometimes you might choose magic because that's where your enemy stats are the worst. Also, you might want to choose melee because that's where you deal the most damage. So you're factoring all these things in. And then you're rolling the dice, which tactically speaking is very satisfying, although it can be very frustrating when you don't roll the ones that you need. Throughout the game, you're going to be leveling up and increasing those stats, so combat will become more and more fulfilling as the game progresses. Runebound 3rd edition does get more fulfilling as the game progresses because you're adding items and weapons and tokens to your pool. However, the flipping of those tokens, first of all, it's not as fun. Second of all, I actually don't, to some extent, I don't like the 50-50 nature, because while 50-50 gives you a better idea as to the conclusion, it doesn't necessarily make you more satisfied when what happens is what you didn't want to happen. And the fact that probability says that there's a 50% chance that you're not going to roll the side of the token that you wanted is a little bit frustrating. There is a ways of mitigating that. You have some symbols that allow you to recast or even flip over tokens to the side of your choice. But even that requires the use of some of your tokens. So that is a little bit frustrating. So again, I'm going to give combat to Runebound 2nd edition. Now, as far as leveling up is concerned, there's basically 2 different ways of leveling up. One is identical, the acquisition of weapons and or assets, right? So in Runebound 2nd edition, you're getting these cards that help you with your attacks and modify different things that you do. In Runebound 3rd edition, what's interesting is you're adding tokens. It's almost the equivalent of being able to add dice to your pool. And so you're buying a card that corresponds with a particular weapon, but you're also getting a tangible representation of that weapon in the form of that token. Now, it would be so cool and probably not very cost productive if they were dice instead of tokens. Like, imagine if each item, each asset, each weapon, each artifact that you acquired throughout the game was actually a dice or a die. That would be incredible. Obviously, it would cost tons of money. You would probably need an enormous box to fit it all in. And the customization to make all of those dice look different would be out of this world. So that's not realistic. But the tokens, again, they do add to that tangible feel of, hey, I'm getting this battle axe, or I'm getting this staff, I'm getting these different items, and now they're in my physical possession, and I'll be using them by casting them. So that's interesting. And those are the ways you level up. But also in Runebound 3rd Edition, the difference is in Runebound 3rd Edition, you're doing the skills, right? You're adding these skills that in theory can be yours throughout the game. You know which missions or which adventures you need to accomplish in order to get the corresponding trophies to turn in for said skills. But I will say this, leveling up I do think is more interesting in Runebound 2nd Edition. First of all, it feels more RPG-like in the sense that you're just adding stats to your already pre-existing stats. So basically, as you accomplish adventures and you get those numbered tokens, you turn them in for your experience counters, which are basically upgrades to your different stats. You can choose which direction you want to improve your character. You can really focus on just adding his mind so that his ranged weapons are basically unstoppable, or you can try to balance him out throughout by having him build him up evenly. So again, it feels more RPG-like. I like the idea that it's just modifiers added to your stats to factor in and to improve your skill tests and to improve your combat resolutions. So again, I'm going to give leveling up to Runebound 2nd Edition. So there's definitely that. Storyline feel, I will say, I think Runebound 3rd Edition is a little bit better storyline feel. And this is why. Most of the storyline in Runebound 2nd Edition is through those event cards. And I've actually played a few games where no event cards came out. And I don't think, so far, I mean, I've only played the game a few times. I don't think I've played any game where there's been more than 2 event cards. And on top of it, the event system, the way it works is that the events have different levels ranging from 1 through 5. And once there's a level 3 event, for example, no level 1 or 2 event can replace that level 3 event. So that level 3 event stays in play until I think a level 3, 4, or 5 come out to replace it. So it's very likely that you'll be playing games where only 1 or 2 events come out. So again, you do have that nice storyline feel. These events definitely change the gameplay and the direction of the game, but they're not a guarantee to come out, and they definitely not guaranteed to come out a lot. But in Runebound 3rd Edition, you have these story cards, and there's always going to be 8 of them, right? And they add lots of flavor to the game, lots of storyline, lots of twists, and lots of tangible spots on the board that you can interact with, even more so than in Runebound 2nd Edition. So I will give the storyline advantage to Runebound 3rd Edition. Now, as far as variety and content is concerned, I already said Runebound 2nd Edition has more heroes. It has more expansions in theory, albeit out of print. Runebound 3rd Edition does have those 2 different quests that you have straight off the box, so it does give a little bit of variety in that sense, and those 2 quests come with their corresponding story plot cards and additional cards that are added into the different encounter decks or the different adventure decks, which will make the games feel different from game to game depending on which quest you have chosen to partake in that game. So content-wise, I guess it's 50-50. It's all a matter of, if you're comparing base game to base game, it's all a matter of if you're more interested in the variety of your different heroes, you got more in Runebound 2nd Edition, or if you're interested in the variety of your opponent or your ultimate mastermind. So there is that. Now let's talk about Endgame. As I said, Endgame is so much more open and fluid in Runebound 2nd Edition. You feel like you're in control, not only of your decisions, but to some extent you're in control of your destiny because you are not on a ticking time bomb. I mean, you are. The Doom track is a ticking time bomb, but you can make decisions that modify that ticking time bomb and slow it down, as opposed to Runebound 3rd Edition, where you don't have a choice. So you can try to play a very aggressive, speedy game, make it quick. To some extent, that's awesome if you don't want to play a long game in Runebound. Or you can try to play a slower game and slow things down because you're not in a rush to end the game. So you do feel like you have control in that regard. Now let's talk about solo play. Solo play, absolutely. Runebound, second edition, totally takes it. It runs away with it. It's just so streamlined. You do not need another player. Runebound third edition, the casting of those tokens, you know, you could do it by yourself, and that is how I play it solo. You cast your own tokens, and you can be objective, and I am. But it's just such a pause in the gameplay, in the flow of the game, in the cadence of the game. It's such a pause, an unnecessary pause, I feel like. I'm sure that the Unbreakable Bonds expansion adds a much more streamlined way of playing solo. Perhaps there's different ways that players could factor in, or online variants. But that way is just a little bit of a halt to the overall flow of the game. Runebound second edition, very streamlined. You just roll the combat dice, make your comparison stats. Very nice, very neat, not fiddly at all. And again, all the modifications that the rulebook specifies for the Doom track and for the experience and the leveling up based on the player count makes Runebound as a solo experience a very neat and cool experience. And then my final overall opinion as to which of these two games is better. Oh, wait, before I get to that, I do want to make the comparison in the actual adventuring in the game, because that's an important one. And I got to give the edge to Runebound 3rd edition. Runebound 2nd edition, again, as I mentioned in the comparison video, it basically, you have 4 different decks, the yellow, the green, the blue, and the red. And all that's determined is that it is the level of difficulty. The green is the easiest and the red is the hardest. And then we have everything else in between. But you know that most of the cards, by far and away, most of the cards are combat cards. They're enemies that you will be fighting. A few of them are encounter cards, and even less of those are event cards. So that's going to happen very seldom. Also, when you go through your events and your encounters, you are not done with that adventure. You're going to keep on flipping from that adventure deck until you finally have a combat. So you are guaranteed to partake in combat every single time you go on an adventure. You just determine how confident you feel about the level of difficulty. In Runebound 3rd edition, as I mentioned, you have 3 different color-coded stacks of adventure cards based on the 3 different types of adventuring. You got combat, you got questing, and you got social encounters. And each of those decks corresponding with that type of adventure is mostly comprised of that adventure. So the combat deck is mostly comprised of combats, and the social encounter is mostly comprised of social encounters. However, there are a few of the other types of adventures, sprinkled in those decks. But for the most part, a hero knows what they're getting themselves into, and that's something you're factoring into your decisions as you're moving through the board, as you're engaging in adventures. So you have the option and the choice of being conservative in your approach. And I like that. I like the ability to be able to choose whether or not I want to fight at all. Maybe I don't even want to fight in the whole game, even though it's really unlikely. But maybe I don't want to do a lot of fighting throughout the game, and I can make that choice. Or maybe I don't have enough health to engage in a fight right now. But you know what? I want to sneak in a little quest or a little social encounter. I want to have those options, right? Also, the fact that those decks are made up mostly of their specified encounter type or adventure type, but have a few of the others sprinkled in, actually leads to spontaneity and surprise, right? The intrigue factor that when you flip that card, you might have not been ready for a combat, but guess what? You've just encountered an enemy and you've got to deal with him or her, and you're not ready. That is exciting. From a gameplay perspective, it's very thrilling. And again, just the idea of feeling like you can make a choice. And now I'm going to move on to my final thoughts and my final, which game wins out. And this is a really tough decision because, again, I actually am an anomaly. I like both games. They will both stay in my collection. They will both get played with decent frequency. It's just a matter of the mood. But I'm going to have to give the slight edge, at least for the time being, this might change, to Runebound 2nd edition. And part of it might be the freshness of it all. But I will say this. Runebound 3rd edition is phenomenal. As I mentioned in these comparisons, I gave the edge to Runebound 3rd edition probably in about as many categories as I gave the edge to Runebound 2nd edition. But what's interesting and what's going to make the difference for me is actually the combat, which again, I love the fact that in Runebound 3rd edition, I don't have to do a lot of combating. And maybe that's why. Maybe it's also because I don't like the way combat is resolved. But in Runebound 2nd edition, it's just such a neat mechanism. I love the fact, especially early on when you have no allies, that you have to choose one of those 3 categories, one of those 3 phases of combat, either range, melee, or magic, in which you want to attack your opponents. The fact that it's not always going to be the same one you choose, because again, you're factoring in your modifiers, the numbers you have to reach for your enemy, the different amount of damages that will be assigned, perhaps even weapons that modify a particular type of attack versus another. You're factoring all these things in and making your decisions one by one. I find that to be a really neat feature. The acquisition of allies as the game progresses to add to your opportunities for combat and for fighting, really, really cool. Because of that mechanism, and because of that mechanism alone, I'm going to give the slight edge to Runebound 2nd edition. If it weren't for that, it'd be even closer, and Runebound 3rd edition might even have the edge. But because of that conflict resolution, I'm going to have to give the edge to Runebound 2nd edition. We'll see. When I make my top 100 games of all time next year, we'll see which game ranks higher among the two and see if my opinions have changed over time. But for now, I'm giving the edge to Runebound 2nd edition. And that's it for my comparison video, guys. Very long, but these are both very thorough games, and I felt that I wanted to do both of them justice in this comparison video. Thank you so much for joining us here When Harry Met Board Games. Comment down below. Perhaps you've played one of these editions. Which one do you prefer? Which one are you more interested in or more curious about? This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.